Figure we'll go ahead and get started. We got about 20 folks in the room. Again, welcome this evening for an excellent conversation between Doctors Tyrone S. Palmer, and Chad Infante. I'll introduce them in a second, but first wanted to talk a bit about this speaker series that we have for this semester at University of Louisiana Lafayette. My name is Dr. Theodore Foster. I'm Assistant Professor of African American History at the University of Louisiana Lafayette in the Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy. Co-organized this convening with Doctors Ian Beamish and Maria Seeger. And indeed, this semester's series is called Conversations in Black Study, which convenes 10 scholars whose collective work deepens our understanding of the interdisciplinary field of Black studies across important themes such as religion, Black feminisms, gender and sexuality, Black and Native literature, affect theory, Black politics and organizing traditions, digital humanities, and public history. I'm going to read a brief quote from Dr. Baddour-Lagra from an excellent talk she gave last year titled Sunlight Through the Fog, Caribbean Thought and the Promise of Black Studies, in which she writes or spoke, I want to suggest that Black studies rightfully holds in awe and Black study is to enact the break. Both necessary, but one holds us and the other releases us. Black study means holding the tradition not to build new cathedrals, but for the purpose of eventually tugging at the threads until it breaks. And so this year's theme is grounded by the above epigraph, distinguishing Black studies from Black study by Dr. Baddour-Lagra, which is archived on the Gilboa Center for Public History website, which is also co-sponsor for this event alongside the Department of History, the College of Liberal Arts, and the Department of English. As a break from institutionalized forms of Black or African-American diaspora studies, Black study confronts rather than resolves internal contradictions in the field. Indeed, tonight's discussion titled The Philosophical Negativity of Black and Native Feeling should help us better understand what it means to enact a break, if indeed we can, with these foundational discourses that Black studies inherits. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Tyrone S. Palmer, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities and lecture in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. His research interests include Black critical thought, affect theory, poetics, and negativity. His work has previously been published or is forthcoming by Parle, Critical Ethnic Studies, Philosophy Today, Contemporaries, Post 45, and Callaloo. Dr. Chad B. Infante is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Maryland, College Park. Chad earned his doctorate in English from Northwestern University in 2018. He's originally from Jamaica and researches Black and Indigenous US and Caribbean literatures, gender, sexuality, critical theory, and political philosophy. His book manuscript in progress entitled Cool, Fratricide, Murder and Metaphysics in Black and Indigenous US Literature studies representations of anti-colonial murder, vengeance, and revenge in Black and Indigenous literature and art as a philosophical response to colonial violence. He is a comparatist and is currently working on several articles that read at the intersection of Black and Native studies, covering a wide array of topics from contemporary politics to animated cartoons and from human-animal relations to cosmography. So we welcome both of you all to this convening. We had an excellent conversation last week with Doctors James Howard Hill and Ahmad Tyree Green Hayes, and really looking forward to this conversation. And so our reading group earlier this week met with Doctors Infante and Palmer to discuss two of their works that I invite you all to read as well. One by Dr. Infante titled Murder and Metaphysics, in which he looks at a short story by Silko titled Tony's Story, and a poem by Audre Lorde titled Power, and an essay by Dr. Palmer titled Otherwise Than Blackness, Feeling, World, and Sublimation. And so I've asked for them to briefly introduce these works, how they came to writing them and doing the kind of research that went behind it, and then talk more broadly about their work and research in Black studies. I think it's really important for us to think through these junior scholars who are really contributing significantly to the field and so many other fields. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to these two, and then we'll have about 15, 20 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. So please welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Tyrone, would you like to go first?
Sure. So thank you, Theo, and Maria, for organizing this, and really glad to be in conversation with Chad, someone who I've been in conversation with for a long time, but it's great to have it, in a public sort of setting. So yeah, in terms of the article, which the reading group read, Otherwise Than Blackness. So where it came from. So it really is just a part of my dissertation. So it's basically emerges from what I would say is my favorite chapter of my dissertation, which looks at, well, I'll tell you what my dissertation as a whole was about. So it was about it was called Anti-Blackness and the Grammars of Affect. And it was really kind of looking at the sort of conceptual ground of affect theory and its sort of, what I argue is sort of foundational anti-Blackness by kind of considering different key tropes and concepts that are sort of prevalent throughout the discourse. So this particular chapter focused on the world in affect theory, particularly the notion that affect creates worlds, right? So like that was kind of the jumping off point for the chapter. I found myself reading a lot of, texts within affect theory and constantly coming across this assertion that affect creates new worlds, or affect or is the materiality of worlding, things of that nature. And so coming across this so often, I was a bit bothered by it because I was like, well, what are we saying here? Like, what is this world that's being created? Why is affect the sort of key term in this endless creation of worlds? And what does this mean for Blackness if we take seriously, Afro-pessimism, right? And the notion that like Blackness necessitates the end of the world, right? And so the article really came out of that on the one hand, and then relatedly, it also emerged out of a certain recurrent tendency that I noticed in reading within Black studies, that kind of would invoke affect as a gateway towards some otherwise world, right? And so the article really just emerged out of trying to really grapple with what are people saying when they say they want an otherwise world or another world, and like what do I mean when I say the end of the world? Like, because I found that there were like a lot of competing and sort of contradictory articulations of that phrase. And so that's kind of where it came from initially. And yeah, like it really represents like the beginning stages of my book manuscript, which I'm working on now. And one of the things that I was really trying to get at in this essay was really trying to think about the desires that are latent in different theoretical gestures within Black studies. And so because this is like a forum for us to think about Black studies and Black study, I'll focus on that aspect of the article because really for me, that was the main takeaway or the main point that I wanted to get across, right? Because like, every year there appears to be some new concept that we all kind of invoke or use without much discernment. I would argue, and so like the otherwise is like one that is particularly prevalent in this particular moment, and yeah, I really want to think about, well, what otherwise than what, and what is the kind of sort of conceptual like provenance of this notion of the otherwise, right? That is being, so widely used. And so that's, what the article was really trying to interrogate. And that's how I get to the notion of sublimation, right? So I argue that these moves toward the otherwise, and sort of invocation of affect as a means toward, creating a new world. All these are sort of like moves of like sublimating, like the sort of negativity of Blackness, and sort of moving away from what I think is actually essential to think with. And this is, I think, where the commonality is between Chad and I's work. You know, as I was rereading Chad's article for this occasion, I was really struck by his notion of a politics of abjection that he articulates in the article, right? And so, like, what is a approach to politics that actually stays with negativity and is not like sort of so eager to transcend it, but actually sees it as the only sort of thing that one can harness or encounter to actually, destroy this world, right? And so, yeah, so I'll let Chad come in now.
Thank you to Theo, and thank you to Maria Siga for organizing this event. And thank you to Tyrone for, being in conversation with me. I continually learn a lot from Tyrone. I think he's one of the most voracious readers I've ever encountered, and widest, and deepest thinkers. And so I've learned a lot about my own work just through having conversations with him. And so even though my work explores representations of revenge and anger and what Sayanai calls negative feelings, it wasn't until I really kind of spoke with Tyrone that I got the sense that I was doing affect, or thinking through affect theory. And it's precisely because I came at it from a Black studies and a Native studies perspective, in which affect studies, right, doesn't necessarily feel necessary. And so when I read a text like Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, that text is entirely about affect, right, and the way that feeling functions to tether and bind, right? And so I realized through Tyrone that I was thinking and engaging, right, with affect exactly in the terms that they were being kind of engaged with in, right, the kind of debate in affect theory itself. But that, I was coming at it from a kind of what felt a very different perspective. And so I think that's been important for my own thinking and trajectory. But in terms of the kind of this particular article, this article also came out of my dissertation, like Tyrone, and it was a part of what was the first chapter, what was in the first chapter, which used Baldwin's text, No Name in the Street, as a jumping off point for thinking about representations of anger, murder, revenge, right, and as a frame through which to bring Black and Indigenous scholars in and writers in conversation with each other. And so it comes out of the work of the dissertation that uses revenge and anger as a way to a negative feeling and abjection, and sitting with the kind of historical with the historical violence of both slavery and conquest as a kind of central point of beginning and entry. And so that kind of centrality of negative feeling to my work is also kind of owes itself to the influence of Frank B. Wilderson's work and his engagement of Black and Native America, which I think was important to provide me a kind of critical frame for thinking about how to engage these two communities, especially from a standpoint of critical negativity. And so I also find his work important. And I think for me and Tyrone, we think through, and with Wilderson, as well as Spillers and Hartman in a lot of ways. And so I think that this article, like Tyrone's work, comes out of a kind of broader desire to, for Black and Native people to not kind of have an easy recourse to hope, and to kind of easy, what might feel easy and what we know is necessarily hard, more quote unquote pleasurable feelings, but to also sit with moments of anger, moments of, discomfort, precisely because I think that that gesture is one of the most important gesture that Black studies offers. And I think that's also one of the kind of centrality and and the central richness of Tyrone's work is the attempt to kind of stay our flight into what might feel like satiating, and positive feeling as a panacea. And so in what ways might thinking through negative feeling, holding on to negative feeling, might provide resources for responding to the kind of political exegesis of our moment, of our current moment, or any kind of racial moment. And so in that way, right, Tyrone and I are very much in conversation, in kind of multiple vectors. And so, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Well, yeah. So, just along these lines, one of the things again that stood out to me when I was rereading this for this occasion was, the way that you talk about something like care, right? Because I think that's another, let's say, buzzword that is like pretty prevalent, and constantly invoked as a certain, antidote to violence, right? But I think what you do so brilliantly in this piece is to show how actually violence and the enactment of retributive violence is the only form of care maybe that is necessary. So I would like for you to talk a bit more about that, because I think the way that you're conceptualizing care in this article is actually quite interesting, and moves away from a certain conflation of care with like feeling good. Yeah.
Care is a kind of really fraught concept in my work, for the reasons you identified. And precisely because the queer and feminist scholars I think with demonstrate that the possibility and the desire for care is constantly thwarted again and again and again. So even if it might be manifest as a truth and a necessity, it is never actualized, precisely because the state constantly polices, Black and Indigenous life and their ability to, for any single moment find respite, a dogged policing of Black and Native life at kind of every level. And I think these Black and Native writers that I particularly think with, identify the kind of dogged nature of the ability to care as itself a problem of the world that might require the end of the world as the only way to really care, and so one of the things that my work highlights is that even though these authors engage violence and engage revenge, they're somewhat ambivalent about it, precisely because as feminist and queer thinkers, they recognize when Black men or Indigenous men take up violence, the tendency as a resistance, the tendency of that violence to return home, because it can never truly be actualized in some ways in the context that it's, it is sometimes conjured or hailed. And so women and queer authors, constantly ask us to consider seriously what it might mean to engage and even think or contemplate about violence, And even as they ask that, they never at one point in time, I think, ask us to truly abandon it, Precisely because they recognize the political exigencies of our moment that demands that imagined violence and a desire for violence is fundamental to Black politics and survival and Indigenous politics and survival. And so in that way, care is this kind of really fraught concept because they're tracking the desire for care, they're tracking the history of violation, the desire for care in response to that violation, an attempt at care, and then ultimately the continued failure of care to remedy the dilemma. And so part of the reason why I look at murder and say not revolution, is precisely because I think these scholars are aiming to demonstrate the difficulty of revolution by isolating it, and framing our engagement of revolution through these, what Fanon would say, moments of cleansing violence, And so for Fanon, these isolated, individualized moments of murder are cleansing violence insofar as they might raise consciousness, but they don't actually amount to transformation in the end. And so for me, murder is a kind of interrogative form. It merely asks the question, It can't offer a remedy to the dilemma. And so I think in that way, it's an attempt right, to think through the emergence of cleansing violence as an, right, and then the kind of attempt or movement from cleansing violence to revolutionary violence as an attempt to care for the constant thwarting of revolutionary violence, right, by the state, by internalized whiteness, by internalized colonialism, by heteropatriarchy, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so relatedly, another thing that I found really important about the work that you're doing in this article is that, like, the fact that you are centering Silko and Lord as theorists of violence, and not merely like as theorists of being subject to violence, but theorists of like the necessity of enacting violence against whiteness, right? And so, like, I think it was particularly clarifying in the context of Lord, because I think, oftentimes she gets read or framed almost like a self-help guru, as if there aren't like multiple other sort of dimensions of her thought. So I thought like the way that you kind of foregrounded that dimension of Lord's thinking was really interesting. And so if you could speak a bit more about that aspect, but also like relatedly, the fact that oftentimes violence in the way that you're theorizing it is seen as a sort of masculinist, as seen as like being under the purview of a sort of masculinist way of approaching things, right? So like, I think it was also important for you to kind of focus on femmes and women as like, enactors of potentially revolutionary violence, not as some sort of masculinism, but actually as rooted in a sort of Black feminist and indigenous feminist ethic, right? And so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thank you, and I mean, I really appreciate the question, because that's one of the central dilemmas of the text, of the texts that I explore, right? Which is they're asking that question about whether or not, right? And for depending on the author, for some authors, it's an easier answer than for others. What they're asking the question about whether or not violence is necessary, and then whether or not violence is inherently masculine, right? And what it is that we do in a context to, at the very least, right, defend ourselves. And I think Hartman's kind of notion of, right, under the structures and institutions of slavery, right, and colonialism, defense is transformed into aggression, right, by the legal codes of the law. And so to merely even defend oneself from being right, hit or struck constitutes an act of aggression against the state. So not even defense, right, is guaranteed Black and Native life. And so in essence, right, some of these acts of care are kind of attempted acts of defense, self-defense, communal defense, right? And then the kind of sacrifices that occur in those attempts. And so I think these authors are constantly debating the consequences. I don't think for, many of them, there's a kind of answer to it, precisely because they know the precarity of espousing violence out loud, right? And if we think about this, I cannot remember the scholar's name, but the name of the text is FBI's, and he talks about, right, the kind of the ghost readers of Black, right, the Black radical tradition from, right, the Harlem Renaissance to the present, and we can think about, the, right, general infiltration of both the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement and the Black Power movement in general, right, by police and, right, the state, to indicate the kind of precarity of even kind of philosophically debating the possibility, right, or lack thereof, of political violence. And so these authors, I think, are kind of concerned from all these angles, right, and attempting to understand how violence could, right, or could not be useful. And so they're somewhat ambivalent, and that ambivalence, I think, is what is also anti-masculine because it's not kind of ambivalence in the European sense of kind of a pure clinical removal. It's an ambivalence in the sense that they understand the desire and centrality to think violence, but they also recognize, right, the lack of the context to enact it or think it as kind of true politics. And so I think that attention to details, to context, to collateral, to, right, sequela, to the possible Pyrrhic victory of, right, engaging violence in this context at the very least is what makes these works, right, particularly non-masculinist in their formula. But of course, very much a part of the kind of long historical tradition of, right, both Black and Native literature, right? And so if we think of Phyllis Wheatley's letter to Samson Occom, the Mohegan preacher Samson Occom, right, she writes, she says, God get him honor on all those who commit vile calamities against their fellow man, right? And what she does is she calls down the avenging God of the Old Testament to, right, with sword and shield to strike down those who are committing violence. And then she goes, this I do not ask, right, for my own gratification, but to demonstrate to them the kind of absurdity of their actions that is divorced, right, from their word. And so this kind of process of naming the thing as it is, naming the rage, naming the desire, but also recognizing the kind of constant presence of surveillance is a kind of important aspect of the way that right, women and queer thinkers think about violence that is somewhat resistant to the kind of easy and recursive nature that kind of heteronormative men kind of, imagine violence as the immediate and kind of only response without maybe thinking more critically about what might the consequences be, right, given the context, right? But all that to say, it's kind of, right, I don't think any of these authors have, many of them kind of come to an absolute conclusion precisely because they also all have their own prejudices and biases that they're working through, and it's kind of displayed in the work, right? Which is what I think their perspective at the least also allows for in a way that the masculinist perspective does not. It's somewhat singular and direct, right? Whereas the kind of feminist and queer approach is kind of multivalent and attempting to approach it from kind of various acute and askewed angles, right? To really get a kind of full scope and perspective of the dilemma as it stands. But I also have, I have some questions for you, Tyrone, because right, one of the things that we think about collectively is kind of both metaphysics and world, right? And the kind of global and historical scope of, right, that metaphysicality of colonialism and the way that it kind of manifests at the level of the everyday, right? I think that kind of, when we really think about that scope, right, and we really take into account that full scale of the kind of colonial project, right, it really just becomes clear, right, that kind of there's a kind of European attempt to enclose and contain the world, and so, I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit more particularly about that formula of containment as it manifests in the relationship between, right, body and mind, because that's also one of the kind of central contentions that your work is trying to, right, think through as it manifests as a central part of the Europeans' version of, right, the world, right? How do right, the kind of effects of that divide manifest in, right, right, the history of enslavement, but also how have Black people responded to, right, that conceptual split?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like, so as much as my work is kind of very critical of like affect theory and a lot of the moves that it makes, I do think like ultimately that like the what affect theory opens up, or at least returns to, is a certain like foregrounding of modes of knowledge that are not that were generally kind of denigrated or seen as like irrational or like not worthy of study, things of that nature. And one of those things is like embodied knowledge, right? So I think that's in many ways rooted in sort of a feminist sort of genealogies, right? And so all that to say, I think that one of the things that I'm interested in in regards to thinking about negativity and Black affect, is like how it is felt as a sort of bodily force, right? But for me, that's not like the same as it being like discrete emotional categories, right? And so this is why I think, you know, what you were saying about how the coolness that modifies fratricide in your work, you know, it's like, it's not about like feeling a particular way that you can identify, you know, right? It's about a certain drive and sensation that is kind of directed toward destruction, but it doesn't necessarily manifest as a sort of negative feeling in the way that we might think of it, right? And so, yeah, I think I am also.
Can I just say quickly
Yeah,
that
please.
one of the things that always helps me think about your work is the Black phrase, I know you feel some type of way. It's this
Right.
like general true indication that there's feeling occurring here, but there's no kind of discrete description of the type of way that one feels. So yeah.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I think, you know, I'm definitely thinking about those distinctions as well, like, you know, in my work. And it's something that I'm, you know, so I have like one chapter of my dissertation that's about like auto-affection, like the sort of notion that like, you know, the subject feels itself into becoming. Like, so that's just kind of like a widespread sort of notion of where affect emerges from, is like this process of auto-affection, right? And so like, I think about that alongside like what Fanon talks about in terms of like a feeling of like non-existence and like sort of aberrations of affect, right? So like, how do you kind of describe a situation in which like, you know, the general way that affect is narrated as emerging doesn't hold, right? Or doesn't apply. And I think because of that, there needs to be a reconceptualization of the entire field, right? Because rather than a kind of application of affect to Black situations or Black life without any sort of kind of consideration of how the very concepts themselves perpetuate anti-Blackness, right? And so, yeah, that's something that I'm trying to work through and articulate in my manuscript and like other projects that I've been working on, for sure.
One one way that I've heard other scholars think particularly about, you know, that divide that helps me think about kind of the way that you were just describing, you know, the work that you're doing on auto-affection is particularly, you know, say the work of African religions and their manifestations, right, in slave practices, and particularly, you know, of course, Haiti and you know, voodoo, and and those kind of religious and political practices as kind of a completely alternative set of constitutional, you know, means of being and existing and feeling in the world. And I guess I'm curious about kind of, you know, hearing a little bit more about the ways that you think about how Black people either kind of mobilize or think, you know, in their own contexts, you know, about how they manifest bodily in the world.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So one of the things is I'm not sure about like the existence of a Black context. And so that's something that I'm really trying to grapple with and think through, because I don't, because for me, that's like, you know, I mean, that this goes back to the question of the intramural, right? Which for me, like the intramural is a fantasy, right? You know, and so like, because of that, you know, I think that there are the moments, and this is what I'm getting at with like a certain negativity that is like consistently sublimated. So there are moments in which like, you know, uh, we encounter it or we feel it like immensely, but then it always has to be diverted into something else because it in many ways is unbearable, right? Right. And so like this is why you know, I'm when I'm like offering this critique of like the otherwise and like, you know, I'm trying not to be pathologize the turn to the otherwise because I understand where it's coming from. And I understand the impulse, right? Because, and I even say this in the article, like, because like, why should, you know, the endless flow of becoming be the purview of, you know, whiteness? However, you know, I think, you know, there's something to be said for, um, you know, I don't know. I just always think about moments where this negativity sort of erupts,
Yeah.
even politically, and then it constantly has to be diverted, you know, almost instantaneously. Like you'll see a moment where like there's a palpable structure of feeling
Yeah.
that's like we're gonna destroy all this shit, right? And then like the next day, it turns into like a sort of pacified marches. And like you know, I don't think that's like one example of what I'm describing, and I guess is more concrete.
Yeah.
But like I think it's just so
Yeah.
it's such a present kind of a
Yeah. I know.
react, you know? Yeah.
I know
Um,
exactly what you mean. And I mean, and I know why, right? Exactly why you give the response you do. And it's because, as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking about, right, one of the kind of really productive things that I really enjoy about the debate between, right, Black study, Afro-pessimism and, right, Black optimism, as well as the debate between Black studies and Native studies in general is that each kind of vein of this, of right, either conversation constantly demonstrates the longevity, right? What we intuitively know, right, as the longevity and older life of historical racism and anti-Blackness, right, as a kind of really particular manifestation, right? And so this narrative, this, right, academic narrative that we've, for so long taken as carte blanche that racism was invented, at the turn of, during Enlightenment is, to a large degree, as we know, right, horse shit, right,
right,
if I'm be frank, right? That racism clearly must have existed far earlier, right? And that in truth and fact, the deeper we dig, we recognize that rather than democracy, freedom, and liberty, that racism and colonialism are the true political essences of the European world as we have inherited it, right? And the dilemma is, as far back as you can dig, it is really difficult to find, right? Um, Articulations about Africa, right, and dark-skinned Africans, particularly from Africa. And so you go to, right, right, if you begin with 1492, right, right, you also have to ask a question about the kind of historical relationship between Africa and Europe and the Middle East, right? And so you ask that question, and then you get to, right, the conquest of North Africa by, right, you get 1441, right, the Portuguese in Guinea, and then you get the conquest of North Africa by the Arab caliphates. Then you dig a little bit deeper and you find the Zand rebellion, right, which is, right, the transportation of a large body of Bantu-speaking people from the Lower Nile, right, in what, 869, right, that revolted in, right, in the first large caliphate. And it's clear, right, if you read the work, I can't remember the name of the scholar, but he's the writer of Black Morocco, right? That the kind of conceptions of Africa and dark-skinned Africa, sub-Saharan Africans existed in a kind of longer intimacy between, right, the what would become, right, the communities that would become, right, right, Muslim and the Christian communities of Europe and the Middle East, as well as, right, the Judaic tradition and the notions of Ham, as well as Cain, all of which swirls with anti-Blackness unendingly, right? Which gets, for me, transformed at the moment of, right, New World discovery into from a local form, which of course in your argument would still be a world form, right, from the European perspective, but in the actual meeting of a place not accounted for at the very least, right, quote unquote, in their terms, it really, right, shifts for a kind of inclusion and a kind of then globalization and true ontologization of, right, Blackness. Because while it might be said that it's true that all those people attempted to conquer, right, Africans and right, and did do so in certain aspects, that they were also probably at that time, precisely because Africa is so large, right, and so rich, that groups of people simply just living their lives unbothered, right, with Europeans to the north, right, Arab conquest to the north, and simply existing. And so we know that that is a truism, but we have literally, right, no material access to that life and possibility, precisely because the world as we have now inherited it is one structured from that outside narrative about Africa. And so, like Fanon says, right, the unearthing of those indigenous practices become near impossible. And especially when it becomes globalized in, right, the encounter between, for me at the very least, between that older European form in the encounter with Africa and the Middle East, transposed to the New World and applied onto, right, and grafted onto, right, in very different ways and categories, though, onto in Native America. But for me then, right, that kind of essentiality of Native America as the place that globalizes Blackness, but also the essentiality of those earlier Black forms mean that Native America particularly and Black people particularly for me are bound by a particular vein of negativity, right? So that's where I find, right, the possibility of their engagement and their work, right? And thinking about that kind of dilemma of the inaccessible pre-colonial, but right, clearly longed for, desired for, dreamt about, right, that we want access to it so badly, precisely because we inherently and intuitively know that there are resources there. But all our attempts to grasp at them, to unearth them, to dig them, right, up is they chip against, right, the English language, they chip against the institution of the, right, the academy. And by the time we get what is left of them, right, they're so withered that it is questionable about how useful they might be to us in any given moment. And so in that way, one of the things I do like about negativity is that it demands an innovation in the face of the decimation of tradition, right? One that is desperately needed in a constant context of targeting, right, and a constant context of violence. And so I think it would be the greatest crime to our kind of political, right, exigencies and, you know, survival, if you care about that at all, to give up those essential aspects of what makes Black study, and what makes kind of critical and good Indigenous studies.
Yeah, that was really illuminating, and made me, it kind of got onto a question that I wanted to ask you, in terms of like, you know, so in your work, it's really clear what the relationship is between Blackness and indigeneity, and like Blackness and Native studies conceptually. But like, I'm also wondering about how you have found navigating those spaces in terms of like institutionally. So, and this can maybe get us onto like, I know, you know, we also wanted to talk a bit about like our institutional experiences with Black studies. And so like, yeah, like how have you found it navigating, you know, your position, like as someone that's doing Black studies and Native studies, and like, how have you found that experience? Yeah.
I mean, so I have to say that, you know, in terms of how I've approached my relationship to Native studies, and how I bring Black studies and Native studies together, is really about, I think, the scholars who I think I'm really in deep and intimate conversation with, and whose work I find important resonance with, particularly on, right, in the vein of negativity. And I think I'm really fortunate to be in a moment in which Indigenous studies is thriving in terms of the kind of prolific nature of scholarship, the kind of innovations in form and research. And so I'm benefiting from a kind of moment of richness in the trajectory of Native studies that also is, I think, inevitably and thankfully and intentionally bringing it in deep conversation with Black studies. And so I find that I have the Indigenous scholars that that I really jive with. I call them the Indigenous cynics, because they kind of really, for me, also hold on to a kind of negativity in a kind of way. And so Jody Bird is one of them. Eve Tuck is another. Patricia Norby is another scholar working in art history whose work I think with. And so I found in terms of the scholarship, it's a good moment. And I've also had really good kind of encounters and relationships with scholars in Indigenous studies. NASA is a phenomenal conference, and it's one that is kind of just increasingly broadening the scope of the kind of rich conceptual work that Indigenous theory and indigeneity as a concept can do. And so the work of De Silva is constantly kind of circulating and is a central feature of some of the Indigenous scholars that I think with. And she's also someone who's always presenting at NASA. And I think it's kind of indicative of the moment of the kind of full imbrication of the conversations between these two communities. Tiffany King's work is also really, phenomenal, in that way. And I've been reading Tiffany King since her dissertation dropped like hot bread, and so and so really, really kind of happy and glad for her work and the book. And her book Black Shows. And I also have a colleague here at UMD who has really been kind of just so generous and sinking her teeth into my work and really offering generative feedback. Her name is Bailey Marquez. And Bailey's thinking about the educational formula of the Hampton Institute that kind of used the industrial post-slavery formula as a formula for educating African Americans, but also educating Indigenous peoples, and the kind of cross sections at which the kind of industrial schools and residential Indigenous residential boarding schools cross-sect. So I think we're at a kind of moment in which it is possible for Black and Native studies to have a kind of prolonged and sustained conversation. But I think to your point and to your question, that it is important that we hold in view the kind of centrality of negative feeling to that conversation, and that without that kind of central focus around the history and the kind of shared history of the catastrophic violence of chattel slavery and New World conquest, that really we wouldn't be having a kind of true version of the conversation. And that for me, part of what I hope my work offers is that part of one of the arguments that I make is that the moments between Black and Native engagement are often fleeting, They, especially before, before our current context, where it feels as if there's a kind of lively conversation, both academically as well as in the terms of literature and art. There are kind of pockets and moments in which Black and Native people are in conversation, and they're usually moments of, to your point, Tyrone, moments of political eruption, and disruption, but they are never sustained. And so I'm part of what my work really wants to imagine is what might a sustained conversation that holds the importance of these two histories, and the violence of these two histories, attempting to leave no kind of ethical, political room for settler white America, but holding kind of full and accountable space for Black and Indigenous history, Black and Indigenous present, Black and Indigenous anger, all as kind of necessary for a kind of foundational politics. And so I think, I can't remember if I answered all of the parts of your question.
It's cool though, because you kind of in your answer, you kind of uh, got you kind of like pointed to something that I kind of experienced as well in terms of my relationship to Black studies, because I feel like with what you said, like you just named people that were doing the work.
Yeah.
And those are the people that allow you to do the work, right?
Yeah.
But like, it's not about like the institutional sort of like home, because there really isn't one. And I feel the same way with regard to like my work and Black studies. Black studies or Black study, I find myself being more, no surprise, cynical about like Black study even as a sort of formulation separate from Black studies, because I feel like Black studies as a sort of institutional force really kind of feeds on this notion of like Black study as this radical thing. And it gets a lot of like sort of you know cred or like like clout basically off of like the existence of Black study. But like in my experience, most of the people whose work I engage with don't actually work in Black studies departments. And like Black studies as a field is like incredibly hostile to basically everyone that I know that does work that's interesting. So like, I think that it's like, for me, the work that I'm able to do, and what kind of keeps me doing my work is being in conversation with, a lot of people like, you, Theo, you, Chad, many people who are in this room, and folks like David Marriott, Excel, just like people who are doing the work, and it's like
I'm
it's just
along. I do. Israel.
yeah. So it's just like interesting to me that like you know because when I came to grad school, and I guess I know we want to touch on this a bit, a little bit of our intellectual histories. So like, I came to grad school, like, we both went to CUNY schools,
Yeah.
so so when I came to grad school from Brooklyn College, like I did take some classes in the Africana Studies department in Brooklyn College. And so I majored in political science, but I minored in Africana Studies. But that was after like a lot of different detours. Like I was majoring in philosophy at one point, and majoring in English at one point. So my kind of trajectory was a bit odd. But like, yeah, Africana Studies at Brooklyn College was not Black studies in the way that we are talking about it, right? It was really like, classes. I mean, I learned a lot through that department and professors in that department, but it wasn't like the conversation that we're kind of engaged in now. And so like when I got to Northwestern, in an African American studies department, I was like very excited about that, and like taking classes with Alex, really exposed me to like Black studies and Sylvia Wynter and her conception of Black studies versus African American studies as its sort of institutionalization. And I was really invested in that, like in Black studies, separate from African American studies. And I don't know, I still am, clearly, because a lot of my work comes out of like a certain frustration with things that I see happening within Black studies. But yeah, I find myself kind of teetering a bit in terms of my investment. It's not as strong as it was before, because I find that like there's so many roadblocks to actually being able to do your work, in a lot of Black studies spaces, and it can be very hostile, right? So that's why I think it's important to like for Theo to be organizing something like this, right? Actually giving space for junior scholars to, just discuss and like share our work, and like not, have to feel so yeah, just yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So
I mean, and I think one of the things you're pointing to is the I mean, I don't know how to say this else, politely, but the kind of the social, right? The kind of over predominance of sociology in African American studies departments.
Yeah.
Let's just say that. And I think sometimes that I think that the kind of overemphasis on that discipline can, I think, take away from a kind of more rich and deeper thinking kind of political response, right, to the, to the kind of need of Black and Native life. And so I do find a frustration with the kind of over predominance of that discipline in African American studies programs, and kind of, wish for a kind of more robust and kind of interdisciplinary kind of structure to really give, Black students everything that they could possibly need in, to tackle the world in which they live, right? So I do find that to be frustrating, which is, to something we've said, which is that kind of some of our favorite scholars tend to be, in Black scholars tend to be, and Native scholars tend to be in kind of traditional departments, even as they kind of constantly, are annoyed with the kind of structure of the university and the disciplinarity of the university, right? But also part of that, as we know, comes from also a dilemma of the kind of underfunding of Black studies as well, which which leads Black studies to use sociology as, right, because the government and, right, programs need, right, use sociology, see sociology as a more kind of right, material and easily interpretable kind of resource, and so, right, the kind of all of it is, colonialism.
Right. Yeah. Basically.
Right.
And I think,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just thought that was a really great point to sort of conclude what was a really rich and generative exchange between you two about the essays and what informed the essays, both in terms of your kind of more expansive thinking, but also the kind of institutional context that birthed your interest in Black studies, right? I too am beholden to a kind of state school context and University of Alabama at Birmingham in the South, and not a CUNY school, which, stands for City University in New York City. And I think it's important to understand like what traditions we came to know the field from, and the attempts to break it down, to pull at the threads, as Bador put it, is so important. A person I want to uplift in this moment is James Garrett, James Jimmy Garrett, who was among those students beaten at San Francisco State University, demanding for Black studies, jailed for that. Prior to his time on campus, he was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and suffered an extraordinary amount of anti-Black violence in the state of Mississippi, seeking to register Black voters. And today, in many ways, has left a lot of the institutional investments in Black studies while continues to practice the kind of work you all talked about in terms of the people who are doing that work, who might not be housed in those disciplinary formations. And so I find it interesting that even to this day, my undergrad institution identifies the project of Black studies, or as they put it, African American studies, right, through the symbolism of the Sankofa, right, as a study of Black people. And we should lift up, love, center Black people. If Blackness is not a critical conceptual category of analysis alongside that inquiry, then I am weary about the kind of social scientific gaze upon the work of Black studies within the institution and the work of Black study within and beyond it, right? And so, my brief question, and I invite folks in the chat to go ahead and throw, or folks in the room, we got about 37 people, we got about another 15, 20 minutes to end the Q&A as opposed to the chat, throw in your question. My brief question for you all, and you all can be as brief as you need to be, is about decontextualization, which maybe is not the same thing as abstraction, both of which have something to do with the moments in which, right, for me, at least in my work, what the 60s signifies for the emergence of Black studies, for the kind of post-civil rights moment, right? And so when I was listening to you all speak, I was remembered of the first time I read Stuart Hall's When Was the Post-Colonial? Thinking at the Limit, which is to say, what are the limitations of this process of decontextualization that results in, for Tyrone, your work around Césaire and the end of the world, but so many other radical discourses, right, that were ostensibly radical at some point. Do we need to return to those contexts to deepen our understanding of those contexts, or are they so impossibly abstracted from them, we have to do something else with them? And the same for you, Chad, in the kind of analysis of these pieces of literature. Audre Lorde also subject to a certain form of decontextualization, abstraction, so much so that your engagement with a poem that was not written yesterday seems and is in many ways profound. So how do we wrestle with that kind of, those contradictions is what I'll offer. I could spend a lot of time on it, but other folk in the room, please feel free to share some questions for our speakers when they come to you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a really great question, Theo. So yeah, I would say that for sure, decontextualization is like a big issue because I mean, I don't think that things are completely need to be completely like wedded to their context. Like I think in a lot of ways, interesting things happen when things are kind of taken away from their context to an extent. But I think you still have to be aware of what the context is, right? And so I think just to like keep it, because there are many examples of this, but just to keep it within the, what I talked about in the article, for me, like what was so annoying was how like the end of the world just became like this thing that people said, like, and so like, everyone was just, but I remember when you couldn't even really say that without people being like branding you an Afro-pessimist and being like really obnoxious. But then immediately, like, not immediately, recently I had noticed that like, then you start to see like ASA panels, like the end of the world and like, but not having anything to do with Afro-pessimism at all, or like Césaire at all, or like any sort of, or Fanon, or like anyone who's actually theorizing that like rigorously. It just becomes like a buzzword, right? And so like, so for me, the decontextualization, it becomes a kind of like a discursive violence because it kind of like removes, people that are doing like really important work and like really trying to think about these issues, and it becomes like this kind of blanket term that gets like used in all these like varying ways that are actually kind of anti revolutionary in many ways, or like counterinsurgent. And so like, yeah, that's where I would say like that the issue arises with that, for sure.
I mean, I don't know if I could add anything, kind of more eloquent than Tyrone has added, except to say that I mean, I think for me, as I hear the question, Theo, I think, like the way that I think about particularly kind of indigenous studies is the kind of appropriation of indigenous like land and right through violent conquest, as well as the kind of colonial desire to become native, right, to own the land and to have the land kind of spiritually be right possessed by them, is an attempt to kind of appropriate context, right, insofar as right, time is largely, as we know, a bloody illusion, right? Time is merely the transformation of matter in space, which means it's just all space, right? And so the kind of illusion of time, right, lends to this false notion of progress, this false notion that things really can change as opposed to merely transforming, and kind of present in different ways, right? Morph, right? Be really kind of, dexterous in its movements. And so for me, right, that is exactly what colonialism does, is it kind of consumes all the matter of the world and then recontextualizes it in its own terms constantly. And our goal, right, and is to kind of constantly battle the untruths of that recontextualization. But to Tyrone's point, we are forced then to decontextualize to survive, right? Which is what, right, life under under severe sites of pressure is. It's pure improvisation, right? And so, right, to that point, it is both simultaneously a kind of necessary formula for all human life, because clearly it, right, we need it when we're in dire straits. But it is also clear that the distribution by which certain people feel, right, that the kind of dire violence of that decontextualization, rather than say the more uplifting transformative possibilities of that decontextualization, is clearly asymmetrical, right? And so, right, that ability to use our own words against us, right, to take the things we make to save ourselves and use it to beat us over the head, it is a vile ability of colonialism that, right, we are constantly attempting to grapple and thwart. And I think that's what also, right, the kind of the feminist and queer scholars writers and scholars that I think with are attempting to, right, that's why they're trying to approach it from so many angles, because it's so bloody tricky and slippery and clearly a lot, right, there's clearly no real rhyme or reason to it. And so even as they're trying to kind of, you know, approach it from various angles, they recognize its constant shifty nature and, right, its constant movement. And so in that way, kind of appropriation and decontextualization, remediation and remediation, all of that is just the means by which, right, Europe recycles the world and then sells it back to us, right, on the capitalist market. Right, sells us our own lives, sells us our own, right, existence, and we buy it, right, to a degree because there's not much else to do in the context, right, that it, or it feels that way, right, in the context as it stands. But I think for me, one of the kind of important things in terms of context is that these authors ask the question because they says, at the very least, if we abandon the thought of even the possibility of revolution, we might miss the moment when the context might arise. And for that instance, then we must, and Wilderson says this, right? We mustn't give up the ability to pose the question of the end of the West, right? And I think that that's what they're trying to do. They're at the very least trying to maintain our ability to pose the question, even if we realize that it is damn near impossible right now. But there might be, you know, if you know, there might be in some, you know, sometime. I won't say some other place though.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the ability to pose the question is really like essential, you know, like I think oftentimes that's kind of seen as not enough, right?
Yeah.
And it's really like where a lot of that's like the common criticism, right, of certain work that's like not you know, that's not
solutionarian.
Right, that's not prescriptive, right? Is like, you know, there wants to be like some sort of you know, 10-point program or something, which is, you know, again, many times I understand the impulse that, you know, these criticisms arise from, but I do think that, you know, the ability to pose a question can't be taken for granted, and oftentimes the question is not posed. But people will just like want to move on to like an otherwise world without even posing the question of what the world is that we want to like remake. Right, because remaking something is not destroying it, right? There's a distinction, right? But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, scope, right? The scope of what would be required could only require constant interrogation, could only require, right, our constant attention, right, to both the kind of grandest questions as well as the most minute detail. And of course, that sounds absolutely tedious, but I think that's right. That's just simply the dilemma. It's not fun. It's tedious. Right? And it manifests in our kind of own interpersonal, you know, kind of lives and work, right? Doing the work on yourselves. It's not fun. It's tedious.
Yeah.
No, that's really helpful. You know, I have been recently in my research looking through the work of SNCC a lot more, and if there's anything that comes out of their organizing, you know, it's the tediousness of that work, of that damn near impossible debate. That, as James Garrett put it, we study to struggle, we struggle to study, right? And so you're caught by that contradiction. And so I was talking with one of my brilliant students I had the fortunate opportunity to work with at UL. And Xavier, who asked a question here. I think he better asked me earlier yesterday when we were discussing some of your essays. And he writes in the Q&A, destruction of the world, to what end and by what means? But he asked me a different question, riffing through Nietzsche, and said, God is dead, so the world is next. And I didn't have the best answer for him because I'm not so rooted in continental philosophy in that kind of way. Although I know both of you have engaged in Nietzsche at some point in your careers, if not specifically in your writing at all, as like the subject, but certainly as part of this chorus of philosophers, right? And so I guess this is more so posed to Tyrone, but is that an appropriate analog? And if so, and if not, where would you turn somebody who's like, you know, eating up black skin white masks voraciously, somebody who is a reader of Black critical theory, but looking for how that question, you know, God is dead, the world is next, fits?
Yeah. So I'm not a Nietzschean, so I'm not gonna try to wade those waters, but you know, I will say that yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, the question of to what end and by what means is important. And it is a question that I try to talk about in the article to the extent that like the end. So when Césaire says like, you know, what can we do? There's the only thing we can do is begin what, you know, and the end of the world, right? So like for me, like I guess I'm sort of resistant to like saying to what end because I don't know. But I think, you know, and that's where like Marriott's reading of Fanon is really useful in that aspect because he talks about like, you know, the tabula rasa, right? So, or something that exceeds conceptualization. So it's not necessarily like, you know, I guess I would say, I don't know to what end, but I know not this. So I feel like, you know, that's really all that I can really say. So it's just like not this and not some like refashioned version of this, which I think is what ultimately people seem to be calling for all the time. Like for me, that's what the otherwise is. You know, it's like a refashioned version of this. I'm not convinced that like, you know, that is what we actually want. Or yeah, so I don't know. I know that's probably not a satisfying answer. But yeah, I'll have to sit with you know, my Nietzsche a bit more to get to like be able to really, you know, speak to what you're saying. But it's an important question for sure.
I mean, I am not by any means. Tyrone, I think, probably might be a little bit more versed in Calvin Warren's work than I. But one thing I love about Calvin's work is I think he demonstrates that there's a kind of that, you know, on the scale of negative feeling, I think he's, you know, the Afro pessimists are actually not as nihilistic as as that, right? Because they, you know, in some ways do call for the end of the world, but maybe that's because I don't have a kind of full enough scope of Calvin's work. But one of the things I think is important, you know, I don't, I guess for me, I really don't think of negativity in the, you know, as kind of nihilistic, precisely because, you know, whether you know, however you might frame it, is the kind of anger, fury, veracity, right, demonstrates at the very least, you know, um, life, I think, for me. And that life, right, in opposition to being targeted just as a kind of simple truth is enough for hold on, I'm losing my train of thought. What was the question you'd ask again, Theo? Oh, Nietzsche. All right, I remember. Thank you. Yeah, and that, you know, that fact alone, right? I mean, I think there's a kind of beautiful tension between, right, how we might understand African Americans and black people who jumped over and those who survived. That's an untenable choice, right? Those who chose to live. That is an untenable choice. And if you take both of those, right, choices that many ancestors made, right, right, some, right, thwarted in either action, right, in their attempt to live or in their attempt to die, right, as the kind of unfathomable dilemma, right, in which we're placed, right, constantly forced to choose, right, between a life in the world as it is or a refusal to, right, participate in what feels like, right? The kind of, that there just has to be something better than this, or that just not, to Tyrone's point, just absolutely not this. And so to me, right, I guess I don't necessarily interpret that as, right, nihilistic, and I don't necessarily interpret it as kind of positivistic either. I interpret it as simply life. It exists. And that is the impulse of, right, the kind of principle of existence, the dilemma of, right, choices of life and death. And so I think where Nietzsche is useful in describing the evolution and the growth of white people and whiteness, right? When he declares God is dead, what he means is the European has killed him, right? He means that the European has killed him and now must become das Übermensch, must now become the replacement to the divine and become the superhuman who is self-sufficient and without suffering. And that is the kind of point at which, the telos at which European society is headed, to abandon living, to abandon the ability to, right, participate in the carnal parts of living, right? Sex, pissing, shitting, right? All of that. They want to transcend that and become pure abstract consciousness and reason and upload themselves into a computer, right? And that's just simply not what life is, right? And that's the telos. That's the ultimate telos, right? You watch all their stories. That's the final goal. That's what they want. They want to become abstract consciousness and roam the universe as divine, right, light, right? And I just think that that is antithetical to life itself. It is a cannibalistic force that destroys life in an attempt to leave it behind. And right, so for me, that's where Nietzsche's work is useful. He describes perfectly, right, not a general condition, but the condition of Europe as it is transformed into a global form.
Tyrone, if you have any last words, I wanted to turn over to you. Otherwise, well, I shouldn't say otherwise, but we might wrap it up.
It's useful sometimes. No, I think Chad, said what needs to be said. So
thank you. No, I was just talking to a grad student of mine about Westworld, and so all I could think about, Chad, I know we've talked about this before, is that kind of fantasy that is consumed so voraciously that I don't think considers that telos that you laid out racially, right? Though it's so present. But I really wish we could be in person so you could hear the round of applause that you would hear, because that was a really excellent conversation. I'm really grateful for this talk. It'll be archived at the Gilbo Center for Public History website, and I look forward to teaching through and with it. Indeed, that's how I came to this, second series, through teaching Badura Lagra's Sunlight Through the Fog. And this question of a break that you can't break, you're constantly tethered to. I think it's so rooted in whatever we might conceive as Black study. And it's always already foundational relationship to Black studies. It's not beyond it, right? In so many ways. And so next, I guess 2 weeks from now, we'll be joined by colleagues of ours, and Dr. Chelsea McHale Frazier and Dr. Brittany Proctor Habil, for an excellent conversation riffing off of this theme titled Being Undisciplined, Black Feminist Study of Gender and Sexuality. And so please register for that Zoom and join us on April 1st at 5:00 p.m. for that talk. Thank you all again who attended, and thank you, Tyrone and Chad. This was a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Tyrone.
Yep. All right.
Y'all take care, and everyone else too. Have a great weekend.